For 900 days, Annabelle Segura's parents believed their daughter was still alive. They borrowed money from wherever they could, mortgaged their home, and waited for every phone call from the kidnappers, constantly reminded that their daughter's safety depended entirely on them. But the truth was something they could never have imagined. Annabelle had been dead just 6 hours after she was taken. On 12 April 1993, the 22-year-old left home to go for a run through an affluent neighborhood in Madrid, Spain, just as she had on so many other mornings. A white van stopped nearby. Two men stepped out, carrying knives. Within minutes, she disappeared from the familiar street, leaving behind her Walkman and several pieces of fabric from her running clothes. From that moment, the Segura family entered a nightmare that would last almost 3 years. 14 ransom calls, dozens of attempts to deliver the money without ever meeting the kidnappers, and a recording of a woman's voice crying and begging to be allowed to return home. The deception was so carefully constructed that no one, not even the police, suspected they were negotiating with kidnappers over someone who had already died. It was only when a television viewer happened to recognize a familiar voice, played during a news broadcast, a voice police had released publicly in the hope that someone might identify it, that the horrifying truth finally began to emerge, leading to arrests that shocked the whole of Spain. This is the true story behind the longest-running kidnapping case in Spanish history, a case in which a lie was maintained for so long that it became one of the cruelest deceptions ever recorded, leaving an entire nation holding its breath for almost 3 years. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss the next stories we bring to you. North of Madrid, within the city of Alcobendas, lies the residential area of La Moraleja, long known as one of the wealthiest places in Spain, with large villas, quiet streets, and residents made up largely of business people, politicians, and families of high social standing. The Segura family lived there. Annabelle's father, José Segura Nájera, held a senior executive position at a major corporation, a career that provided the family with a comfortable lifestyle and a respected social standing known throughout the area. Annabelle, the only child in the family, was studying at university when the events took place. Friends and acquaintances described her as an energetic young woman who regularly went jogging through the neighborhood each morning, a simple form of exercise that, only a short time later, would become the fateful moment that changed her family's life forever. Far from that affluent neighborhood of luxury villas, two men were living entirely different lives. Emilio Muñoz Guadix and Cándido Ortiz Añón had grown up together since childhood, building a friendship that lasted for decades before they both became involved in a crime that would shock the entire country. According to accounts later presented in a Netflix documentary, Muñoz had experienced serious financial difficulties, particularly after purchasing a house in the town of Pantoja. The pressure of debt weighed heavily on him for months, gradually pushing him towards increasingly reckless ideas about how to turn his family's financial situation around. It was during this period of financial hardship that Muñoz proposed an idea to his close friend Ortiz. To carry out a kidnapping in an affluent area and target whoever happened to appear, there was no specific plan and no carefully researched individual selected in advance. That random choice would later become one of the most haunting details of the entire case. Annabelle was not targeted because of any personal grudge, nor had she ever had any previous connection to the two kidnappers. She was simply a young woman who happened to be in the right place at the exact moment Muñoz and Ortiz decided to put their plan into action. Muñoz's wife, Felisa Garcia, also became part of the wider story, although at first she had no knowledge of the criminal plan her husband was preparing. Her role in the case would only begin some time later, when Muñoz needed a woman's voice to maintain the deception directed at the Segura family. For those who knew either of the two families, the Seguras and the Muñozes, no one could have imagined that the divide in wealth between their two completely separate worlds was about to collide in such a devastating way, turning an ordinary morning jog into the beginning of one of the most shocking criminal cases in modern Spanish history. The morning of 12 April 1993 began like any other ordinary day for both families, completely separate, their lives having never crossed, until fate brought them into the same story. At around 10 a.m., Annabelle began her usual jogging route through the neighborhood, a routine she followed every day, no different from hundreds of mornings before. A white van slowly approached and then came to a stop not far from her. Emilio Muñoz and Cándido Ortiz got out and approached Annabelle with a knife in hand. She tried to resist. The struggle was brief, but violent enough to leave evidence behind. Part of her sports clothing and her Walkman fell onto the road as the two kidnappers overpowered her and forced her into the vehicle. A security guard working at a nearby school heard unusual sounds. He was not wearing his glasses at the time and was therefore unable to provide a detailed description of the vehicle or the people involved. Even so, he immediately called the police and reported that a young woman had been forced into a vehicle against her will. Inside the van, The situation quickly became more chaotic than Munoz and Ortiz had ever imagined. Neither man had prepared a specific location where they could hold their victim. Their plan, if it could be called a plan at all, had gone no further than abducting someone, while everything that followed had been left entirely unresolved. They drove around for several hours, trying to discuss and decide what to do next while still on the road, with Annabelle being held in the back of the vehicle. During this period, Annabelle tried to escape. When an opportunity arose, she attempted to jump out of the vehicle. The effort, though courageous, was unsuccessful. The two kidnappers quickly chased after her, overpowered her, and forced her back into the van. Eventually, Munoz and Ortiz decided to take her to an abandoned brick factory in Numancia de la Sagra, in the province of Toledo, around 50 kilometers from the original abduction site. The distance was far enough to separate them completely from the crowded area, while the isolated location reduced the risk of being seen by anyone. Meanwhile, in Madrid, the report made by the school security guard had reached the police. With only limited and unclear information available, no vehicle registration number and no clear description of the suspects, authorities faced a major challenge from the very first hours of the investigation. When the Segura family realized that their daughter had not returned from her run, they entered the first hours of panic in what would become a long and painful ordeal. At that moment, none of them could have imagined the true scale of the tragedy that was about to unfold. By late afternoon, when the van finally stopped outside the abandoned brick factory, Munoz and Ortiz had still not fully agreed on what to do next. Tension between the two men began to rise at the scene, a warning sign of what would happen only a few hours later. Throughout the long journey from morning until evening, Annabelle had no idea what truly awaited her. Only a few hours later, that unknown reality would become an irreversible tragedy. For residents of La Moraleja, Annabelle's unusual disappearance quickly became known throughout the neighborhood, creating a shared sense of fear within a community that had long believed itself completely safe behind the solid walls of its luxury homes. Inside the abandoned brick factory, one notable detail was revealed by Munoz himself many years later during a 2013 interview with Spanish television network La Sexta. Overwhelmed by fear, Annabelle believed that the two kidnappers intended to sexually assault her. Munoz later recalled reassuring her at the time, "No, don't worry. We're not that kind of people. This is a kidnapping. We want money." That reassurance, although it may have briefly calmed her, did nothing to change the fate that truly awaited Annabelle. As night fell, the tension between Munoz and Ortiz escalated into a heated argument, unfolding directly in front of their victim. Both men panicked at the possibility that Annabelle had memorized their faces and the registration number of the van details that could allow police to identify them if she were released. For two inexperienced kidnappers with no contingency plan for such a situation, the fear of being recognized gradually overwhelmed whatever reason they had left. Their argument, as reconstructed in the Netflix documentary, clearly reflected the panic of two men who had never prepared themselves for the true consequences of their actions. Having obtained enough information to continue their ransom plan, including the family's telephone number and the names of Annabelle's parents, Munoz and Ortiz, reached their final decision at 9:30 p.m. According to the case file, the cause of death was determined to be strangulation. Only around 6 hours had passed since the white van stopped on a street in La Moraleja, yet the entire life of a 22-year-old woman had already been decided. What is particularly significant, and what would later make the case especially cruel, is that, from that moment onward, both Munoz and Ortiz were fully aware that their original ransom plan could no longer proceed in the usual way. They still possessed all the information needed to contact the Segura family, but the person they had promised to return was no longer there to come home. This moment marked the darkest turning point in the entire story, not only because of what they had done, but because of the decision they were about to make next. Rather than facing the consequences or ending their plan, they chose the complete opposite path. They decided to continue pretending that Annabelle was still alive, and to keep demanding ransom money from her family as though nothing had changed. This was the beginning of a deception that would continue for almost 900 days, a carefully sustained chain of lies that coldly exploited the love and desperation of Annabelle's parents, who continued to believe that their daughter was waiting to be rescued, rather than having died many months earlier. For the two kidnappers, this was perhaps the coldest calculation in their entire course of actions, turning the crime they had just committed into a means of continuing to profit. Rather than ending the scheme or accepting responsibility from the very beginning, during the first 48 hours after Annabelle disappeared, the Segura family lived in a state of overwhelming uncertainty, unable to know whether their daughter had been involved in an accident, had left of her own accord, or had become the victim of something far more serious. Spanish police formally opened a missing person investigation immediately after receiving the family's report, based on the limited information provided by the school security guard who had witnessed the incident. Exactly 48 hours after the abduction, The telephone at the Segura home rang. On the other end of the line, an unfamiliar voice asked to speak directly with Jose. It was the first of a total of 14 calls the family would endure over the next nearly 3 years. The kidnappers requested that messages be passed through Rafael Escurado Rodriguez, a longtime family friend and lawyer who would serve as an intermediary throughout the negotiations that followed. Their first message was clear. They had kidnapped his daughter. She was safe. They wanted nothing other than her safety. And that safety depended entirely on the family's actions. The initial ransom demand was set at 50 million pesetas. The kidnappers instructed the family to prepare the money in a sports bag and wait for further directions. They also issued a clear threat. If the family failed to follow their instructions, or if they discovered that police were involved, Annabelle would suffer serious consequences. Although the threat was intended to place the family under intense psychological pressure, it had, in reality, already lost all meaning because Annabelle's fate had been decided many hours earlier. For the Segura family, that first call brought a strange and painful mixture of emotions: terror at learning that their daughter had been kidnapped, but also a faint glimmer of hope that she was still alive and still had a chance of returning home if they followed every instruction. Police were immediately informed of this new development. The case shifted from a standard missing person investigation to an organized kidnapping for ransom investigation, bringing in specialized units with experience in handling complex crimes of this kind. Jose, following the kidnappers' initial demands, began preparing the requested sum. At the same time, he worked closely with police, trying to balance the need to follow the instructions in order to protect his daughter with the need to assist authorities in identifying those responsible. Although Spanish media had not yet been given the full details at this stage, journalists began taking notice of the disappearance of a young woman from La Moraleja. It marked the beginning of public attention that would continue to grow over the following months, eventually turning the case into one of the stories the entire country would follow for years. These were only the first days of the long and painful ordeal the Segura family was about to endure, an ordeal that, at the time, none of them could have imagined would continue for as long as 900 days. From the very first days, Spanish police deployed a specialized team to work closely with the Segura family during every contact with the kidnappers. Every incoming call was recorded and carefully analyzed, with investigators searching for any clue that might reveal the identity or location of those behind the crime. Telephone tracing technology in the early 1990s was significantly more limited than it is by modern standards. Tracing the origin of a call required time, while the kidnappers consistently kept their conversations brief, avoiding the disclosure of any technical detail that could be used to track them. On several occasions, following instructions from the kidnappers, the family and undercover police arranged meetings to deliver the ransom, hoping these would provide an opportunity to arrest the perpetrators at the scene. Yet every time, the kidnappers failed to appear. This unusual level of caution led many investigators to question the situation. From an early stage, were they dealing with an experienced and highly organized criminal group, or simply inexperienced offenders who had been fortunate enough to avoid every trap set for them? In reality, as would later become clear, the inexperience of Munoz and Ortiz was precisely what made them more difficult to catch, not because their planning was sophisticated, but because their behavior was too unpredictable and too unconventional for police to accurately anticipate their next move. Police also pursued more traditional lines of inquiry, reviewing individuals with previous convictions related to kidnapping and extortion across Madrid and the surrounding provinces. Hundreds of names were examined, and dozens of people were called in for questioning, but none of the leads produced any concrete results. Criminal psychologists were also brought in to analyze recordings of the calls, attempting to build a psychological profile of the kidnappers based on their voices, manner of expression, and small details in their speech that might reveal clues about their background or living environment. With every failed ransom exchange, the Segura family's emotional state deteriorated further. Rafael Escurado, acting as the intermediary, he had to constantly balance cooperation with police against maintaining the kidnappers' trust that the family was faithfully following every instruction and had not betrayed them in any way. Police also expanded their surveillance across several areas surrounding Madrid, hoping to identify any suspicious activity that might be connected to the place where Annabelle was being held, completely unaware that, in reality, there was no longer any place of captivity to find, because she had already been gone for a very long time. This was the central tragedy of the entire early stage of the investigation. Every resource and every effort by law enforcement was directed towards rescuing someone who could no longer be saved, even though, at the time, none of those involved had any reason to suspect otherwise. 3 months after the abduction, an unexpected parcel arrived at the Segura family home. Inside was a cassette tape. It was the first time the kidnappers had sent evidence in the form of a recording, rather than communicating only through direct telephone calls as they had before. When they played it, The family heard the voice of a woman identifying herself as Annabelle, crying and pleading to be allowed to return home. For her parents, it was the first time in many weeks that they had heard anything resembling their daughter's voice. The cassette was immediately sent to a forensic laboratory for analysis. Audio experts compared the vocal characteristics on the recording with older recordings of Annabelle supplied by her family from home videos to previously stored telephone conversations. The initial analysis produced no definitive conclusion. Voice identification technology in the mid-1990s still had significant limitations and had not reached the level of accuracy available through modern forensic audio analysis. Experts could only confirm that the voice on the tape belonged to an adult woman. They could not determine with certainty whether it was Annabelle. At the same time, forensic technicians examined the cassette itself, searching for fingerprints, DNA traces, or any characteristics of the packaging, the type of tape, or the recording method that might reveal further information about its origin. No valuable biological evidence was found on the cassette. The items recovered from the original abduction scene, the Walkman and a piece of fabric from Annabelle's sports clothing, were also sent for detailed examination. However, they provided no significant clues about the identity of the kidnappers. These items were more useful in confirming the location and timing of the incident than in directly leading investigators to those responsible. For the Segura family, listening to the recording again and again became a painful ritual repeated throughout the months that followed. They searched for the smallest detail, for any familiar word or expression that might confirm beyond doubt that the voice truly belonged to their daughter. What neither the family nor any of the forensic experts involved in the analysis could have imagined was that the voice did not belong to Annabelle at all. It was the voice of Felisa Garcia Munoz's wife who had agreed to take part in this cruel deception, although the extent to which she truly understood the serious nature of what she was helping to conceal remains unclear. The failure of the initial voice analysis, although deeply disappointing at the time, would later become an important warning sign. The limited technology of the era had inadvertently allowed the deception to continue, rather than exposing it during the first months of the investigation. The cassette, together with its inconclusive analysis, was carefully preserved in the case file. It became one of the most important pieces of evidence, one whose decisive role would not truly emerge until almost 2 years later. Over the next 2 years, the ransom calls continued at irregular and infrequent intervals, sometimes separated by only a few weeks, while at other times, months passed in silence before the telephone suddenly rang again. Each time, the Segura family was forced to endure the same familiar emotional cycle: hope, preparation, and then disappointment when the kidnappers once again failed to appear at the agreed meeting point. By 1995, after almost 2 years of investigation without any significant breakthrough, Spanish police faced a pivotal decision. Traditional investigative methods, surveillance, technical analysis, and the review of potential suspects had exhausted their ability to produce new results. With the investigation remaining at a prolonged standstill, the investigative team made a bold decision, one rarely used in kidnapping cases, to release the voice recording to the public and ask anyone who recognized the voice to contact authorities. It was a high-risk gamble. Making the evidence public could alert the kidnappers, cause them to change their methods of communication, or even lead them to end all contact with the family altogether. However, with every other line of inquiry exhausted, police decided that this was the final opportunity worth pursuing. The recording was broadcast on television news programs across the country, accompanied by a direct appeal from police. Anyone who recognized the voice, even if they had only the slightest suspicion, was urged to come forward immediately. The Annabelle Segura case, which had quietly gripped public attention for 2 years, once again became the focus of the entire nation of Spain. Police hotlines immediately received a large number of calls from across the country. Most were unsupported guesses and theories based more on imagination than on genuine evidence. Investigators were forced to examine every call individually, separating potentially valuable information from the baseless speculation flooding the hotline. Among the countless calls, a resident of Escalona, in the province of Toledo, contacted police and stated with certainty that he recognized the voice of Candido Ortiz Añón, a man he had known personally. This was the first lead with genuine investigative value, entirely different from the hundreds of unsupported calls that had come before it. Police immediately began verifying the information, comparing it with Ortiz's personal records and searching for any potential connection between him and the case. This included checking whether he had ever appeared on the original list of possible suspects, despite never having been seriously investigated at the time. Within just a few days, police confirmed that there were sufficient grounds to take the next steps to place Ortiz under covert surveillance, gather further evidence, and prepare for an arrest that, after almost 2.5 years of dead ends, finally appeared to be within reach. For the Segura family, news of this new lead brought a sense of cautious hope. After so many disappointments, they did not allow themselves to believe fully until more concrete and reliable evidence could be established. On 28 September 1995, Spanish police launched a coordinated operation to arrest all three suspects, Emilio Muñoz Guadix, Candido Ortiz Añón, and Felisa Garcia. Ortiz was arrested while carrying out his usual work repairing plumbing for a customer. According to the reconstruction featured in the Netflix documentary, he showed no surprise and offered no resistance when he was handcuffed. Instead, he admitted that he had expected this moment to come and had even quietly been waiting for the day of his arrest because he could no longer continue living with such overwhelming guilt. For many investigators involved in the case, this reaction reflected the enormous psychological burden Ortiz had carried for almost 2.5 years, living two parallel lives, one as an ordinary plumber, and the other as an accomplice in one of the most shocking crimes in the country's history. Muñoz was also arrested that same day at a different location. Unlike Ortiz, fewer details were recorded about his initial reaction to police, although both men later began cooperating with investigators during questioning. Felisa Garcia, Muñoz's wife, was arrested at the same time over her alleged role in recording a voice impersonating Annabelle. Her involvement made her an official accomplice in the wider case, despite not having directly participated in the original abduction. During the initial questioning, both Muñoz and Ortiz quickly admitted their involvement in the abduction, an unexpected level of cooperation that stood in complete contrast to the nearly 2.5 years they had spent avoiding authorities and maintaining an elaborate deception. For the Segura family, news of the arrests came entirely without warning, not through another familiar ransom call, but through an official notification from police that those responsible for the tragedy that had consumed their lives for almost 3 years had finally been taken into custody. The news spread rapidly across Spain. After following the case closely for nearly 3 years, people throughout the country experienced a mixture of relief and outrage. Relief that investigators had finally found a concrete lead, an outrage that such a cruel deception had been allowed to continue for so long without being uncovered sooner. Yet the strongest emotion overshadowing everything else was anxious anticipation. Was Annabelle still alive? After almost 3 years without a single image or any direct evidence confirming that she was safe, this question weighed heavily not only on the Segura family, but also on a nation that had followed her story for so long. The answer, painfully, would come within only a few days, not in the way anyone in the Segura family had ever dared to hope. Immediately after completing the initial arrest procedures, investigators moved into the intensive questioning phase, their final effort to determine Annabelle's true fate after nearly 3 years of unanswered questions. Inside the interrogation room, Muñoz and Ortiz were questioned separately by investigators, a standard strategy used to compare their accounts and identify any inconsistencies that might exist between the two versions of events. Although they were questioned independently, both men provided remarkably consistent details about what had happened, from the timing of the abduction and the route they traveled to the final decision that led to Annabelle's tragic fate. What neither the investigative team nor the Segura family could have prepared themselves to hear was that both men confirmed Annabelle had been dead for almost 3 years, not for several months, not for 1 year, but almost from the very first hours after her abduction. All 14 ransom calls, the fabricated voice recording, and the failed attempts to arrange ransom exchanges had been part of a deception maintained around someone who was no longer alive. The truth left even the most experienced investigators shocked by the extent of the coldness and calculation shown by the two accomplices. During questioning, both Muñoz and Ortiz agreed to reveal the exact location where they had buried Annabelle's body near the abandoned brick factory in Numancia de la Sagra. Ironically, police had searched the area several times during the investigation that had lasted almost 3 years, yet it had never been examined thoroughly enough to uncover the truth. On 30 September 1995, just 2 days after the arrests, forensic teams and police began excavating the location identified by the suspects. As they had stated, Annabelle Segura's remains were found there, bringing an end to the long 900 days that had passed since she was abducted. The number 900 would later become an enduring and haunting symbol of the case. It was more than simply a measure of time. It represented the scale of the deception and the prolonged suffering of a family whose trust had been exploited for almost 3 full years. For the Segura family, receiving the final confirmation despite the overwhelming pain also brought a certain form of release. After nearly 3 years suspended between hope and despair, they could finally begin the funeral arrangements and formally say goodbye to their daughter. This was something many families of victims in similar cases never receive, a clear confession and a specific location, allowing them to bring at least some closure to the uncertainty that had haunted them for so long, even though the pain of losing their daughter remained unchanged. After the remains were officially identified, prosecutors began compiling the entire body of evidence gathered throughout nearly 3 years of investigation, combining the new confessions from Muñoz and Ortiz with evidence that had previously been considered insufficient to carry significant legal weight. The cassette tape that had puzzled audio experts in 1993 was now re-examined. The voice on the recording was officially confirmed to belong to Felisa Garcia, not Annabelle. This detail strengthened the case against her, not merely that she knew about the crime, but that she had actively participated in maintaining the deception against the victim's family. All 14 ransom calls, which had been carefully recorded over several years, now became direct evidence for the prosecution. Each call formed another piece of the case, confirming the organized and calculated involvement of both Munoz and Ortiz in keeping the extortion scheme alive. Prosecutors also obtained testimony from Rafael Escoredo, the intermediary who had personally taken part in every contact with the kidnappers, as well as from several other witnesses who had been present during the earlier unsuccessful attempts to deliver the ransom. Based on the full body of evidence, prosecutors formally brought 4 separate charges against Munoz and Ortiz: kidnapping, murder involving betrayal and deception, unlawful detention, and conspiracy to commit fraud. Together, the charges reflected the full complexity and multiple layers of the crimes they had committed. A separate case was prepared against Felisa Garcia, focusing on her role as an accomplice in recording the voice impersonation. Although her actions were not directly connected to Annabelle's death, they played a crucial role in prolonging the deception for almost 3 years. The defense teams, representing all 3 defendants, began reviewing the entire case file and preparing their legal strategies for the upcoming trial. With such a substantial body of evidence, including direct confessions from the defendants themselves, there was almost no room left to deny responsibility entirely. For the Segura family, the preparation of the legal case unfolded alongside the final funeral arrangements for Annabelle, 2 painful processes taking place at the same time, forcing them to confront their loss while also preparing themselves for the trial ahead. Meanwhile, Spanish media continued to follow every development closely, preparing for what would become one of the most highly anticipated trials in the country for many years. In 1996, the Provincial Court of Toledo formally brought the case to trial. Faced with overwhelming evidence and direct confessions from the defendants, the proceedings moved relatively quickly compared with many other complex criminal cases of the time. The court found both Munoz and Ortiz guilty on all 4 charges: kidnapping, murder involving treachery, unlawful detention, and conspiracy to commit fraud. Each man was sentenced to 39 years in prison. Felisa Garcia received a separate sentence of 6 months imprisonment, reflecting her indirect role as an accomplice in the wider case, which was entirely different from the direct and leading roles played by the 2 men. Dissatisfied with the original sentences, prosecutors appealed to a higher court, arguing that the calculated and cruel nature of the crime, particularly the decision to maintain the deception for almost 3 years, warranted even harsher punishment. In 1999, the Supreme Court of Spain upheld the appeal and formally increased the sentences of both Munoz and Ortiz to 43 years imprisonment each. This became the final ruling, bringing the entire legal process that had begun with their arrests to an official close. For the Spanish public, the final sentences brought a sense that justice had been served, although no prison term could ever truly compensate for what the Segura family had endured throughout those long 900 days. The case was soon regarded as one of the most significant milestones in the history of modern Spanish criminal justice, not only because of the severity of the crime, but also because of the police decision to release evidence to the public, a bold strategy that would later be studied and adopted by other law enforcement agencies. For the Segura family, the end of the trial marked the legal conclusion of a painful chapter that had lasted almost 6 years from the day Annabelle disappeared to the moment the final sentences officially came into effect. But for Annabelle's parents, the journey towards finding inner peace and learning to live with an irreplaceable loss had only truly begun. In 2009, Candido Ortiz Añón died in prison, while still serving his sentence for the crime committed more than a decade earlier. He never had the opportunity to walk free and face the outside world again. Emilio Munoz Guadix, by contrast, was released in November 2013 after serving only 18 years in prison, following a ruling by the European Court of Human Rights that changed the way prison sentences were calculated in Spain. After his release, Munoz gave an interview to Libertad Digital, insisting that he did not consider himself a danger to society. He said, "I made a serious mistake, which I accepted from the beginning. I have served my sentence." When asked whether he had ever seen a psychologist during his time in prison, Munoz admitted that he had not, while also claiming that it would not have made any significant difference. Munoz's remarks, once widely reported across Spanish media, sparked strong and divided reactions among the public. Many believed that his attitude showed a lack of genuine remorse proportionate to the seriousness of the crime he had committed. 32 years have passed since that fateful morning in April 1993. Annabelle Segura's name remains present in the memories of people across Madrid, not only through old newspaper reports, but also through a community center named in her honor and a bus displayed prominently outside the building, serving as a permanent reminder of a life cut far too short. In 2024, Annabelle's story was told once again to a new generation of viewers through the Netflix documentary series 900 Days Without Annabelle. It gave those who had never heard of the case an opportunity to understand the extraordinary cruelty behind one of the longest-running deceptions ever recorded in modern criminal history. Ultimately, Annabelle Segura's story is not only a reminder of the cruelty human beings can inflict upon one another, it is also a testament to the strength of family love, a love powerful enough to make her parents willing to sacrifice everything for even the smallest hope that their daughter might still have a chance to return home. For those who have followed this case across the decades, perhaps its deepest lesson lies in the number 900 itself, a symbol of the frightening distance between the truth and what people are willing to believe when love and desperation become inseparably intertwined.